Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar brought to you by Techstrong and Delphix. My name is Jared Harris, and I'll be your host for today's discussion. We've got an exciting panel ahead of you, but before we begin, I do have a few housekeeping notes. Today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion or you'd like to share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after the webinar concludes, and a link to access as well. If you have any questions, we'd like for you to submit them in the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen. This is also where you'll find the chat tab where you can engage with our speakers as well as your fellow audience members, share your thoughts, or just tell us where you're tuning in from. Be sure to check out the materials for the presentation and additional handouts that we've got in the handouts tab. Finally, at the conclusion of our webinar, we'll be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around to find out if you're a winner. Let's go ahead and kick off our program for the 5 best practices for safeguarding Salesforce data. Today, we're joined with Matthew Ye, Vice President of Product Marketing at Delphix, and Roberto Seminaro, Senior Product Manager at Delphix Compliance Services. At this time, it's my pleasure to turn the program over to you, Matthew.
Thanks, Jared, and thanks everyone for joining the webinar. My name is Matthew Ye. I lead the product marketing team at Delphix, and I'm joined by Roberto, who is one of our product leads at Delphix as well. And we're here today to share some knowledge about protecting Salesforce, which has become really the de facto standard for managing customer data in the enterprise. My background has been in the data privacy and data governance space, and Roberto is an expert in Salesforce security, having worked with some of our customers to design a Salesforce data compliance solution here at Delphix. And our hope is that we're able to share some very practical guidance around how to make sure that customer data, one of your company's most important assets, really stays safe. So we structured the content to call out 5 of what we think are some of the most important areas to consider when you're building a Salesforce data compliance and security program. Some of these areas will be ones you perhaps already addressed in your organization, but I think a couple of these will be less obvious. And we're hoping to help you identify gaps or vulnerabilities you may have, and then point out key requirements for filling those gaps. I want to start out by underscoring the idea that Salesforce is filled with both security and compliance risks. As the centerpiece of the customer record, sensitive information like names, email addresses, credit card numbers, financial info, and other personally identifiable information, PII, is distributed across the application's data fields. You can see some of those listed here in the cloud. PII is both in the live production instance you rely on, as well as the sandbox environments used for testing, development and analytics and other use cases. And you have hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals touching your implementation, which of course multiply your security challenge. So Salesforce data can really be a single mistake away from being publicly exposed. Moreover, regional industry privacy laws like GDPR, CCPA, PCI, and HIPAA, some of the ones listed here on the left, they demand tighter controls around PII while also threatening significant penalties for violations. So we're going to walk you through some, again, very practical steps you can take right now to mitigate that very serious security and compliance risk. And the first place to start is really to understand the current security and compliance environment. And I think it's fairly self-evident that over the last decade, we've seen a very significant shift in businesses' IT posture from being focused on the on-prem data center to adopting the multi-cloud. All right, so applications and data today are distributed across private cloud, public clouds like AWS, Azure, GCP, and of course, SaaS-based platforms like Salesforce. And this dramatically expands your attack surface and distributes your assets across multiple locations, all of which may have different security models. And this shift's been accompanied by an increasingly severe cybersecurity threat environment where you have sophisticated attacks making headlines almost every day, ransomware gangs, hostile nation states that all attack businesses. And in response to these changes, enterprises themselves have evolved their security posture. They're moving from a model of high trust, where you're establishing a security perimeter around your on-prem assets, but letting those inside the perimeter operate with a fair amount of freedom. And they're moving to a zero trust posture, where your default position is to not trust any person or system that wants to touch any of your assets. And we'll, of course, talk later about applying zero trust principles to Salesforce and Salesforce data. Customer data, of course, is often the crown jewel that attackers seek to steal or otherwise compromise. As an example, 2 years ago, attackers stole 30 million customer records from one of the largest global telecoms in the world. The attack exploited a weakness in the telecoms dev and test servers, which is a common attack vector because so-called non-production environments for dev, test, and analytics contain most of the organization's sensitive customer data. Those environments are also less scrutinized from a security perspective, and we'll talk more about this specific attack vector as it applies to Salesforce later. The company ended up having to pay $350 million in a class action lawsuit settlement, with $150 million of that being allocated towards remediating their customer data security vulnerabilities. In response to the idea that businesses need to be good stewards of consumer data and provide customer privacy and protection, governments have introduced increasingly stringent regulations, right? So GDPR from the EU is perhaps the first really comprehensive regional privacy law that has had a very significant impact on just about every global business. But other countries and US states have followed suit, including the state of California with CCPA and the state of New York. Globally, Brazil, South Africa, and several other countries have introduced laws that are roughly modeled on GDPR. Industry laws like HIPAA for healthcare and PCI for companies that process credit card information all lay out requirements for handling personally identifiable information. The common theme across these regulations is that they are far-reaching in terms of which companies must observe the regulations. For example, GDPR, you don't need to be headquartered in the EU to be bound by that regulation. As long as you collect data from EU citizens, you're subject to the law. The regulations are also fairly liberal in terms of what data is considered personal. And then all of these privacy laws also come with strict penalties. The penalties can be delivered on a per violation basis, on a per record breach basis, or they can even take a percentage of top line revenue from the offender. In the case of GDPR, it's 2% of revenue. Salesforce and Salesforce customers are certainly in scope for all of these regulations. So CRM leaders and admins absolutely must understand what requirements these regulations drive. Which leads us to best practice number 2. Since all of the regulations I just noted, they all have language in place that says something to the effect that businesses are responsible for putting in place proper controls for limiting access to PII. Probably the first thing that Salesforce customers absolutely need to do is determine if they have the right roles and permissions in place. And within the Salesforce world, the key objects for doing this sit at the user and profile level. So for users, you'll need to make sure strong passwords and timed resets are required, and that there's a strict deactivation policy set up, for example, for employees that are departing. Profile configurations will then let you manage which users can see what. Here is where it's essential that you've segregated profiles such that only authorized users have access to PII. And we want this to be a small number of privileged individuals. You want to be especially careful about contractors and third-party access to ensure you're managing their profiles correctly. and you want to make sure you're operating with zero trust principles in mind, right? So your default position should be to deny access. So I think that having profile or role-based access configured is critical, and most enterprises understand this. Where we see they tend to fall down is in the rest of this life cycle. Access control should not be a set it and forget it step. You need to have a program in place to periodically audit and adjust at fixed intervals. So you need to proactively monitor activity, look for suspicious activity. In particular, Salesforce has a login forensics tool to help you keep on top of which users are making changes and to spot anomalies in login history that could be signs of trouble. So in short, you need to be vigilant about users, roles, and associated permissions to make sure you have the right gates in place. But that's not enough. You also need to protect the customer data itself. Looking at the left side of this chart here, Salesforce provides a certain level of data encryption in its standard offerings. It also has premium offerings like Shield platform encryption that gives you more fine-grained control around how data is encrypted. Then there's also data masking that's going to be really important in protecting data while still ensuring it's usable for dev, test, and analytics. Encryption is great for things like protecting data in motion, but it renders the data unusable for development purposes. And we'll talk more about masking in a moment, but it's really the standard way of protecting customer data in your sandboxes. And then finally, you need a documented approach to responding to an incident. This includes things like admin playbooks for how to remediate an incident like data filtration, ransomware, system downtime. But it also includes things like how to report an incident publicly and notify affected parties. That's something that privacy laws like GDPR specifically mandate. All right, so we know we have to control access to customer data and do things like ensure that sensitive data is encrypted or masked. But how do we actually find that sensitive information? And that is indeed something that every business using Salesforce needs to do, since it's the precursor to putting in place the right data controls. Generally speaking, there are three ways to do this. The first two listed here on the right are manual or process-centric in nature. Number one, you can simply go through a brute force manual inspection process. This can be quite onerous, given that Salesforce fields are complex and sprawling, but has the advantage of leveraging people within your org that understand your business and have knowledge of what fields may or may not be sensitive in nature. Number two, you can go through a similar approach, but hire an auditor or other specialist firm to do this. This is also usually slow and can be expensive, but has the advantage of being executed by a team that's done this before, and has expertise. They have a refined process. You also get a stamp of approval from a third party, which can be valuable. And number three here, you can leverage a technology-driven approach and utilize a data discovery tool. This can often be faster because discovery solutions can be tuned specifically for Salesforce, and they will already understand where sensitive data typically resides in the default schema. It's also something that's repeatable, that your organization can make a part of your regular process as your data and your Salesforce implementation changes over time. And we just talked about setting up your data controls as being a regular, repeatable process. Well, repeatedly running sensitive data discovery can definitely be a best practice and be inserted as a part of that regular process. One really important thing I want to call out is that sensitive data discovery will help you understand where your sensitive data is in your production environment. At the same time, it will also help you pinpoint the sensitive data that actually makes its way downstream into your non-prod sandbox environments used for dev, test, integration, analytics. Your Salesforce implementation is really made up of these two types of instances, production and non-production. And what we see is that for every production instance, organizations typically have multiple sandbox copies. And since sandboxes can contain data that's copied over from production, the sandbox environments will often contain most of your surface area of risk for data breach. So remember that the telecom breach example I mentioned earlier, the data was actually stolen out of sandboxes, not the production environment. So when you run your sensitive data discovery process, it's critical to understand that the results of discovery inform how you'll protect your prod data, but also your sandboxes, and you'll typically control that data with a masking solution. Salesforce is customizable. Again, thus it has many dev environments for teams to go in and build new capabilities. To give you a little bit of feel for the types of sandbox environments out there, there are developer and developer pro sandboxes that are much smaller in size and usually do not contain production data. Your sensitive data discovery might not apply to these environments, but the two in the rightmost columns here, partial and full copy, contain most or all of the sensitive data you have in the live instance. So you need to do something to protect the sensitive data here, and Roberto is going to cover this in a moment. But in summary, sensitive data discovery is a needed step in securing your entire Salesforce implementation, production and sandboxes. And that's going to set you up to put the right data control measures in place. And I'm going to turn it over to Roberto, who's going to explain what some of those measures are. So Roberto, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Matt. So yeah, after identifying sensitive data in your sandboxes, the next step is to secure it. And so there's many ways of doing it. We suggest looking for approaches that not only de-identify your data, but that also maintain realism of that data that will make it in the end usable for both development and testing. So as you see here, we want to make sure that data like full names, social security numbers, and dates of birth still look like them after masking it, after securing it. And so we typically call this process, data masking. And so what to look for in data masking techniques? We typically look for three properties. The first one is that the masking technique that you use should be safe. And that means that it shouldn't only transform your data and de-identify it, but you also should do it irreversibly. So that means that data shouldn't be backsolved to its initial state. So that usually goes back to having a strong cryptographic algorithm that makes sure that it's hard to, or almost impossible with current software or computing power to backsolve. So the second property we look for is realism, right? Mass data should resemble production data. And that makes the data both usable for development workflows as well as for any sort of automated or manual testing. And finally, consistent. Masking data needs to usually respect the consistency between the different tables or even different data sources. We need to keep that referential integrity intact so that the testing is meaningful. And so there are multiple data masking techniques, and by no means the list here is comprehensive. Also, no single transformation or technique is best for all. They all have trade-offs. For example, nullifying a value is the easiest way to keep your data safe, but it pretty much renders the data useless. However, in some cases, it might be the best decision you want to use for a certain column or field. There are other algorithms, for example, randomization algorithms help you de-identify your data, so they definitely keep it safe. And even with the correct seeding, randomization algorithms should also help keep data consistent. However, not all data will be realistic under randomization techniques. For example, social security numbers might be randomizable, but names typically can't be randomized because they lose their meaning or value. There are other variations of randomization, for example, character mapping algorithms. These randomize groups of values, so this helps respect more complex data patterns while also applying some randomizations. There are other masking techniques that have been built to specifically mask certain domains or data types. For example, there could be algorithms explicitly designed to mask phone numbers, credit card data, addresses, healthcare data. And their methods differ. There are multiple ways in which they can be developed, but these typically are pretty comprehensive and very realistic. The challenge, though, is that they're harder to come by. You need to develop or spend more time creating them or maintaining them. Finally, there are categories of masking techniques like substitution or secure lookups. And these are a great set of algorithms or transformations because they're some of the best in keeping data consistent. For example, the secure lookup algorithm is backed by hashing functions that typically guarantees that values will be masked consistently to the same masked values. And how it does it, it generates collisions to keep the transformation and the data masking safe and ensuring it can be reversed. All of these have trade-offs. As you go down the list, the algorithms are harder to maintain and develop. For example, domain-specific or secure lookup algorithms require more development work, lookup tables, and more. Our recommendation is to look for a tool that gives you access to many different techniques, to most of these, both the simple ones and the complex ones, and also a tool that, or an internal process that helps you keep consistency between different tables and different databases or applications. We also recommend looking for a combination of out-of-the-box algorithms, but also some that allow you to be customized. Out-of-the-box help you get started fast. They're easy to use, but many times what we've seen is customers reach out certain nuances of their data that need to be handled in certain specific ways. And so customizations are also needed for handling those specific cases and the specifics of your data. And the third point is you got to make sure that the algorithms you're using, the transformation, the data masking techniques are secure. These need to have been tested in the market, cryptographic hash functions. It's very easy to think that designing an in-house transformation or data masking technique is simple, but many times those might not be safe. So you got to make sure you're using the right security practices in place to guarantee the security of those transformations. Now, getting into the specifics of how to mask Salesforce, and we know that with Salesforce, speed is valuable, right? You need a tool that either knows Salesforce or minimizes scripting time. What we've seen is that when trying to script and use things like data loader or directly calling Salesforce APIs, it becomes very challenging to mask Salesforce data. And also Salesforce has a lot of embedded logic, built-in logic, automation flows. And so you need to also consider that. So the steps that typically are followed on a Salesforce sandbox masking process is that it starts with a refresh or a sandbox creation. That is when new data reaches your sandbox, and therefore it needs to be masked. The next step is to understand your metadata and the schema of your Salesforce and your sandboxes. The truth is that Salesforce has a lot of logic embedded into its application. Unlike a database that has very simple logic, Salesforce has a lot of automation embedded that usually makes masking a lot more challenging. For example, there might be validation rules. In other cases, you might see automated triggers. For example, a trigger might have a set of cascading actions when a new contact is created. And these actions can be things like notifying users, creating additional entries, assigning accounts, contacts. But when masking, we're not really creating a new contact per se. So we don't need the automation to be triggered. And so we recommend that when thinking about masking, you recognize all the nuances of your object model and some of the higher level logic that's embedded in your Salesforce deployment, and either use a tool that can manage it all and disable it for the masking process, or to adapt your workflows to respect that logic. So after disabling packages, the next step is to mask the sandbox data, which was just recently refreshed. And finally, the sandbox needs to be left in a metadata state that resembles the pre-masked status. So all validation rules, triggers, and everything else should be re-enabled after masking so that it's, again, usable and realistic for both development and testing. And so our last and fifth point is how to use Salesforce sandbox data in the context of development and testing workflows. So the goal of masking Salesforce sandboxes is to ensure that data can be safely used across multiple sandboxes, multiple lower environments, and used confidently by testers and developers. So picking the right algorithms that keep data realism and consistency goes a long way in making the data and making it useful for testing. But the truth is that Salesforce data rarely lives in isolation. So masking consistently not only in between tables within Salesforce, but also across other applications is critical. Most of the time, data is fed into Salesforce from other applications or from Salesforce to other downstream applications. And as the centerpiece of the customer records, it is likely that multiple downstream applications will use Salesforce data. For example, your contact data might be in Salesforce, your products and SKU data might be in a different PLM software, and you might need to use both of these to feed data into your ERP, like SAP, to track orders. And so masking in this context should be done in a way that respects the relevant references. Customer IDs or last names should be consistent across all of those and make sure that they're mapped consistently after they're masked. Our recommendation is that in that context, we recommend that you identify which other systems feed data into or out of Salesforce. And when thinking about tools, look for those that support multiple applications or databases, especially those you're using today or planning to use in the future. And also look for tools that support masking with the referential integrity, that keep that consistency that's very valuable in the context of testing. So we want to share with you one tool, or the tool that we built for masking masking Salesforce sandboxes. It's called Delphix Compliance Services. And basically what we do with Delphix Compliance Services for CRM is that we try to make Salesforce masking realistic, safe, and consistent. So you'll see that out of the box, you'll have multiple algorithm frameworks already built in, so data masking techniques. We'll have character mapping algorithms, lookup algorithms, some domain-specific ones, as well as other more generic transformation types. We also offer some out-of-the-box options. Those are ideal to get you started as fast as possible. But we also offer you the ability to customize those, to adapt to the nuances of your data. The second point is that we realize the context of masking consistently across a broader ecosystem. So if you're masking other databases or applications, such as SAP, Oracle, SQL Server, Postgres, or many others, you can mask those consistently with Salesforce. And finally, sandbox compliance in 3 easy steps. We're trying to make compliance as smooth as possible. We know that Salesforce speed is valuable, and so we typically speak Salesforce. So all the connectivity, masking, metadata management is taken care of without any scripting needs. We also provide a set of pre-identified sensitive fields. So we've basically scanned the Salesforce schema so that you can get started faster. So next step, what I'm going to do is instead of telling you more about it, I want to do a quick demo of how the solution works. So I'll start sharing my screen here. And I'm logged into the application. So the first step is to create a connection between Delphix and your sandbox. So I'll go ahead and click New Connector. And I'll give this a user-friendly name, webinar test, and I'll click Authorize. So this will prompt me to sign into my sandbox. I'm in test.salesforce.com. I'll provide my credentials for the sandbox. And they should propagate the credentials from Salesforce back to Delphix. And we should be ready to test the connection. Just make sure that it's the right sandbox, that we can access the different APIs that we need, and that it's the right sandbox for my case. So I'll click Next, and I'll save. So here what's going on is Delphix is establishing a connection with your sandbox. We're testing, ensuring we have access to the right APIs so that we can both read data, understand what's your schema like, and then in the future mask it. We're only fetching metadata, so only table and column names, which will be used to define the rules and the masking techniques that you want to apply to your specific sandbox. So the sandbox is synchronized. I'll go ahead and start a job. So I'll go to jobs and click on new job. So I'll select the webinar test connector I just created and click next. So here, it's a rules and selection process. And so you can select a group of rules that have been predefined for your sandbox. In this case, Delphix provides a set of defaults, so the Delphix compliance superset. What we've done is we've dived deep into the Salesforce schema, the object model, and the fields that many of our customers typically consider sensitive. And we've mapped those fields to certain out-of-the-box Delphix algorithms so that you get a head start in the masking process. So you'll see that this specific rule set applies to 96 different fields across 10 different tables within this specific Salesforce instance. I'll go ahead and customize the rules to show you how to apply and change algorithms and data masking techniques. And finally, when I was referring to managing the metadata and the packages of your Salesforce instance, this is what I was referring to. Out of the box, by default, we manage the packages. So we disable triggers, constraints, indexes, and anything else that might get in the way of masking. In this specific case, just in the interest of time, I'll skip that process to make the masking process faster. It's a simple sandbox that I've created here. So that should be okay. So I'll go and click next. Here you'll see basically your entire Salesforce schema. And you can take several different actions here. For example, if you want to filter all first name instances, you can click apply a filter to first name. You'll see that first name instances in my sandbox are spread out across a number of different tables. Some of them already have a masking algorithm applied to it because of the Delphix compliance superset. You could potentially batch apply algorithm to all of them if you need to. I could also go ahead and search for specific tables. For example, I could go to the account table. I see here that the account name is being masked with a certain algorithm. So I could potentially change the assignments here if I want to, if I think I could find a better algorithm. So for example, I look for another option, business legal entity lookup. So I'll go ahead and select this algorithm, and I'll keep everything else the same. You can also search for custom tables. So I think I have a custom table here, custom test _C. So you'll see also if you have any custom tables or custom fields, those will also be shown here. And obviously you get all the object schema from your Salesforce sandbox. But I'll go ahead and get started with the Delphix compliance superset with that specific change I only made to one of the algorithms. So I'll click next, and this is a summary of the job, and I'll get started. I'll quickly go to Salesforce to see how the data is right before I start. Hopefully I'm fast enough so that I can see the data before. So just logging in here. This is the sandbox that I've been connecting to. So I'll go to my account and see how the data is before. So I haven't masked the billing state. So given that I've sorted everything by billing state, if these values change, that's a suggestion that data got masked. So I'll go back. The job is in progress. It should take about a couple minutes. In the meantime, I want to go to compliance, just show you a few things here. So you have rule sets. Rule sets are where you host the logic of how you want to transform and mask the fields that you deem sensitive. So you can see that Delphix compliance superset, as well as some other rules that I might have created in the past, and you can create new ones as well. Also, we have an algorithm section. So you will see that there's a number of out-of-the-box algorithms. These are built in, and you can use them. You have descriptions and details of how they work. And you have a number of these that you can use right away. But you can also create new algorithms. For example, I'm just going to quickly do something here. So I'll click on next, and you'll see that there's a number of different frameworks that you can pick from. Each framework has its own configuration. So for character mapping, I have to select character groups. For things like regex decompose, you have to select regex statements. And so each algorithm framework can be customized depending on your specific data needs. Something else you can do is you can import algorithms from a Delphix continuous compliance engine that you might be using to mask certain databases on premise, Oracle, SQL, SAP, some other applications as well. So this helps you import those algorithms and make sure that you're masking consistently between Salesforce and some of those other applications as well. So I'll go back to jobs and see what the status is. So the job completed. I'll go back to my sandbox. So I'll try to remember this couple first. So the column is the same, so we see that the values changed. So that's in a nutshell how Delphix Compliance Services work. You can see here the summary progress of the job. So out of 18,000 values, 6,000 of those sensitive items got masked, which is around 36% of the total number of values in that sandbox. So again, bottom line, what we want to make sure is that you don't have to, know the Salesforce API, know the Salesforce schema in detail. You just have to come here, select the rules, identify sensitive data, and define how you want to mask your different fields with multiple out-of-the-box algorithms. And so, yeah, that's the demo. I'm gonna go back here to the slides, and Matt, please, you can take it off from here.
Awesome. Thank you, Roberto. That was a great demo. If you want to learn more about Delphix Compliance Services, really the best way is to check out our free trial. So we offer a 14-day free trial experience that will let you connect to your sandboxes, configure your rules, and run real masking jobs. So all the functionality is available to you. You can go to the handouts section in the browser for the webinar, and you should see a link there if you're interested. I encourage you to do that. And just to kind of wrap things up here before we get to Q&A, hopefully this session was helpful and puts your business on a path towards greater Salesforce security and compliance. We think the 5 best practices here should be an important part of any Salesforce program. If you have any questions about Salesforce compliance in general, or Delphix Compliance Services, you can put those in the chat or reach out to us here at the email addresses. And with that, let's get into questions. And we have a few in the chat already in the Q&A section, and I'll start to go through these. And Roberto, I think this is a good one for you. What Salesforce clouds or products does Delphix Compliance Services support?
Yeah, so we support everything within force.com. So you think about some of the most typical Salesforce clouds within force.com. We have the Sales Cloud, Services Cloud, Health Cloud, Financial Services Cloud. And so it's everything within force.com. What we don't support is the Marketing Cloud. So that's different, basically different endpoint, different service altogether. But pretty much everything else within force.com is supported by Delphix Compliance Services.
Okay, thanks, Roberto. Here's a question that's like kind of a follow-up there is, Roberto, I'm hoping you can answer this one. Is this a Salesforce only solution? The thought being that it'd be good to adopt something that can be used across other databases, as well as using the solution for Salesforce specifically.
Right, and so Delphix provides multiple different capabilities for masking multiple databases and applications. Delphix Compliance Services specifically currently supports Salesforce. We intend to expand capabilities to other SaaS applications as well. But we support as Delphix multiple other data sources as well. We have a complete matrix of support in our website. You can check it out. Those are managed on-premise. Delphix Compliance Services is a SaaS offering, and so that's the only difference. But we do intend to expand the SaaS offering, Delphix Compliance Services, support matrix in the coming future.
Okay, thanks, Roberto. So question here about privacy regulations, specifically how does masking impact right to be forgotten or deletion provisions in laws such as GDPR? It's a really good question. Many of the privacy laws, like GDPR, they have provisions in them that require the deletion of PII when a customer requests that they want their personal data to be erased. What masking does in that scenario is that it essentially exempts you from having to execute the request for the non-production environments where you've applied masking. So since the process of masking transforms the real data values into fictitious values, you're preventing anyone from tracing data back to an individual. Thus, you've eliminated the PII. So for areas where you're not applying masking, for example, a production environment, you still need to honor the deletion request, but you will be essentially exempt from doing that in non-production. Good question. So there's another one here about, do we mask all sandbox data, partial and full sandboxes? So recall that the different Salesforce sandbox offerings, you have the developer sandboxes. Those typically don't have production data. They're quite small, but partial and full sandboxes, they are loaded with production data and are periodically refreshed. So the production data is making its way downstream into those. We do definitely recommend masking those instances.
And just another, Matt, so sometimes we've seen that developer or developer pro sandboxes also have production data. I mean, they don't get automatically refreshed from production, but sometimes their scripts or data loader is being used or some other backup is being used and it's being fed some production data. And those also need to be masked, right? It's usually what we've seen is those have a very large surface area. There might be hundreds of developer sandboxes across your org. And so the surface area is quite large. So if there's any production data in those sandboxes, those can also be masked with Delphix Compliance Services. And we recommend you mask them if they have any sort of sensitive data in there through some other data loading process that you might be executing.
Great clarification, Roberto. And this is a good kind of follow-up here is how often are teams typically doing the masking? What do you recommend? How do you incorporate masking into kind of the regular maintenance or management of the sandboxes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say there are two scenarios. One is with data refreshes. So sandbox gets refreshed on a regular cadence usually. You're limited by Salesforce to 5 days for partial copy sandboxes and 29 days for full copy sandboxes. So typically what happens is that's the lower limit. So after that, I've seen some teams refreshing exactly when the sandbox can be refreshed. So after 29 days for full copy sandboxes, that is to immediately trigger the masking job. Delphix Compliance Services offers APIs so that you can automate the process of masking right away, even before adding users to your sandbox. And so that's typically the pattern that we see. So it depends on how frequently Salesforce sandboxes are refreshed. The other approach is new sandboxes getting created. And so that's the other moment in which data masking makes sense, right? And so either it's a new partial or new full copy sandbox that also should trigger a data masking process. If it's one of the smaller sandboxes, if it's feeding data from some sort of production data, then we also recommend that you mask those immediately after the sandbox is created. You can automate the process of masking through APIs to make sure that it's as fast as possible and the data is saved right away.
Great. Another question here about dynamic data masking and whether or not that is something that you would use for sandbox data. In general, there are two categories of masking: static and dynamic. Static masking is what Delphix offers, and what we've described here in the webinar, where you're irreversibly transforming the data at rest that's being stored. The data itself is changed. Dynamic masking is a different approach in which you're still storing the sensitive data, you're not changing that. But when there is an attempt to access or query underlying data, a dynamic masking solution essentially intercepts the data access request. It will then determine if the request involves sensitive data. And if it does, it will mask specifically those relevant values before returning the data back to the requester. So this is something that is an approach in general that's sometimes used to production applications. We don't recommend this approach for sandbox data because your sensitive data in the sandbox is still sensitive. It's still vulnerable to exfiltration. It can limit who sees PII, but it does not actually eliminate the PII. Good question there. It looks like there are a couple of kind of Delphix Compliance Services specific questions. Roberto, hoping you can help with these. How do we know which sandbox to use when you make a new connection using the application?
Do you mind repeating that question, Matt?
Yeah. So how does DCS know which sandbox I believe you're going to mask when you make a new connection? How do you pick the sandbox?
Oh, right. When going through the OAuth process, you have the option of, you're basically redirected to test.salesforce.com. And so typically your login credentials within test.salesforce.com will have a sandbox identifier appended to your username. And so that's when you know which sandbox you're using. So basically you're logging into a specific sandbox, authenticating through it, and that gets propagated back into Delphix. So you're not authenticating through your production Salesforce. You are specifically authenticating and connecting Delphix to that specific sandbox you want to mask.
Great, thanks, Roberto. I think we have time for one last question. Roberto, you touched on this a little bit in one of the earlier questions you addressed, but I think this is an interesting one. Is the sandbox available to developers after creation, but prior to masking? Is there a risk that devs access the sandbox before the masking?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that typically goes back to process and how you decide to implement the masking routine, right? So, and the sandbox creation and the sandbox refresh process. So sandbox refreshes and sandbox creations typically have the option to run scripts. You have Apex scripts that you can run before or after the sandbox is created. So typically a sandbox gets created with basically all the users from production, and you can drop those. So as part of your scripts of sandbox creation, you can selectively drop every single user except for your admin user, the one who's actually, driving the masking and the automation and the sandbox creation process. And so what we recommend is that you do that you drop your users before masking. So after the sandbox is created, you drop users right away, and then you start the masking process. Basically, there's no users, nobody has access to it except the admin. Then data is masked within the sandbox, and post-masking, you can write a script or an automation or have a process, an Apex script to re-instantiate some of those users that specifically want to access the sandbox. So that's how we typically recommend and how we've seen this process be implemented.
Okay, thanks, Roberto. I think that is it for the questions. Jared, I'm going to turn it over back to you.
All right, that was outstanding. Matthew, Roberto, thank you for taking the time to join our discussion and share your expertise with us. A quick reminder to everyone that today's session is recorded. Following the panel, you will receive an email with a link to access the recording for the on-demand. You can also find the recording on our DevOps website. Just go to devops.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it'll be waiting for you there. As I mentioned, there are gift card winners. I'm going to go ahead and let you know who they are. We've got, let's see, Braden R, Edith B, Clarissa C, and Dave C. Congratulations to the 4 of you. Make sure that you keep an eye on your inbox so you can claim your gift card. If you don't receive it, be sure to check your spam folder. Matthew, Roberto, again, thank you again for taking the time to be with us. I'd also like to thank Delphix for sponsoring today's webinar. And again, to all of our audience, thank you for being with us for the entirety of the presentation. Upon closing the webinar, there will be a quick survey. Please let us know your thoughts, share with us what you want to hear next time, what we can do to improve. Outside of that, I am Jared Harris. I'll be signing out, and I hope you guys all have a great rest of your day.